name is Phill Dwight Morgan. I'm a freelance writer and activist in Toronto. I think one of the problems with the way that we're talking about race in this election is that it's being injected into particular issues when in reality it's part of all conversations. You know, when we're talking about housing, when we're talking about childcare, healthcare, any of these things, there are discrepancies and inequalities that exist that cut along lines of race, class, gender, etc. So to act as if race is this thing that's separate from all of those issues and that we can just talk about when it's time to have the race conversation is actually misleading. It's part and parcel of all the issues that we face every day. Yeah, in terms of how the mainstream media has dealt with race, I mean, in a nutshell, it's been atrocious. Most racialized folks that I know that work in media are pretty burnt out from the questions that are asked of them or the stories that they're asked to report on. My phone is never ringing off the hook more than when there's an incident like the Trudeau blackface thing, for example. And what was interesting with that particular scandal is that a lot of white journalists were complicit in not naming it for what it was. There were very few pieces that actually talked about it as racism or linked it to larger issues of racism in terms of policy and governance. It was all about how he apologized and we need to move forward from this, etc., etc. And what I actually found, I as a racialized journalist and writer was getting a lot of backlash from people that were rushing to the defense of Trudeau. And that's ridiculous. Like, why on earth would I be taking the brunt of Trudeau wearing blackface? For me, that issue sort of reveals the issues that come up when there's a lack of representation in media. And we just need more people of color in newsrooms, on editorial boards. We need more people of color to help steer the conversation in a more nuanced direction and to actually name things for what they are. What I see right now in mainstream media is what I would call, what other people have called sort of both sidism. So in an effort to create a sense of being unbiased and impartial, both sides are presented, but oftentimes what that does is it actually skews the conversation. So using climate change, for example, 99% of the science shows that climate change is real, that it's very urgent, and yet if you present that 1% that says, actually climate change is not really happening, it's not a big deal, and you present that on the same ground, you skew the conversation. That's 100% what's happening in Canada when it comes to race. It's very clear that racism is a problem in this country. We live in a settler colonial state that perpetuates acts of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism on a daily basis, on all levels. And yet the conversation is about, well, is that really racist? Did that happen? There's an effort to present both sides, when in actuality there's one side. Again, that we live in a settler colonial racist state. So until we can just accept that and start to unpack that, we're never going to be able to move forward in terms of how we talk about race. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of folks on the ground that are already fighting against Bill 21. I think that we need to see stronger positions from our politicians. It's been deeply concerning to me, deeply troubling to see the way that elected officials have again treated this as a political topic rather than a sort of, rather than a moral issue, rather than an ethical issue. I think when you look at the legal challenges to Bill 21, it's quite clear some of the problems that exist. So not only is it discriminatory, but the vagueness of the term religious symbols leaves it open for interpretation, which means that there's a lot of discrimination that happens when that ban on religious symbols is applied. Now, to be clear, that's not me arguing for a more robust definition of religious symbols, but I'm just saying that it's pretty obvious that there's particular groups that are being affected by Bill 21 and that it's disproportionately harming racialized people, Muslims, folks wearing hijab and niqab and so on. There are so many different ways that this needs to be fought, and we need to really name the impacts that it's having. People are leaving Quebec to go to other provinces to secure employment and other opportunities because those things are no longer available to them in Quebec. It's unconstitutional, and we can't accept that. A lot of people mistakenly think that carding has been banned in Toronto. There has been some legislation put in place to help restrict it a little bit, but in terms of what that translates to on the ground, I haven't really heard anything in terms of substantive improvements. Many people are still being impacted by carding, but I think the conversation actually needs to be a broader conversation about policing in Ontario and in Toronto and in Canada. The police have a huge lobby that they mobilize on a regular basis. I've personally debated the president of the Police Association on radio and on television, and every time there's an issue with policing, he gets the spotlight to sort of talk about how the police need more money and they need more opportunities. Now, for me, when we talk just about carding, we're missing an opportunity to talk about policing. There is so much inequality in the city of Toronto, for example, where I live. Inequality in housing, inequality in healthcare, income inequality. All of these things, in my opinion, are exacerbated by policing. The police are very much involved in creating segregated geographies within the city that cut along lines of race and class. So in terms of how do we end carding, I think we need to have a broader, more nuanced and robust conversation around policing writ large, and we need to start asking for more accountability for police and actually seeing enforcement in those accountability measures. Because as it stands right now, people in the city and in the province have been complaining about the harms inflicted by police for decades, and there's been very little action to actually address the harms that have been inflicted by police. So it starts with accountability and arguably police reform with, in my opinion, the larger vision of police and prison abolition entirely.